Hi everyone. Welcome to my talk. This is creative feedback for building up teams. Uh, One second. I'm getting an echo. Is anybody else getting an echo? Okay. Okay, I think I'm okay now. Sorry about that. It's weird to hear yourself in your ear. Oh, that's what's happening. Okay. All right. I I was talking to myself, everyone. Apparently, I was listening to the stream on Twitch, and that's what I was hearing. Okay, great. Let's get started. Okay, so this is my talk, creative feedback for building up teams. My name is Hector Antunes, and I'm a lead animator and project art director at Firaxis Games. I've been in the games industry for 14 years, and I've spent about half of that time in a lead role. Most recently, I was the project art director on XCOM Chimera Squad. Before that, I had the great pleasure of leading the animation team on Civilization 6. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have worked on several games for both of these franchises, and I've learned a ton from working with different teams over the years, both as an artist and a lead. And I'm excited to share some of those lessons with you today. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the role that feedback plays in building a team. Team building is more than just bringing together a bunch of talented artists and letting them do what they do best. It's been really important to me over the past few years to figure out how to best nurture a culture within a team that focuses not just on the end result, but on continuous growth, trust, and respect. I've learned that how we have approached feedback has played a huge role in accomplishing that. So how can feedback help us nurture a culture of trust, support, and growth? When participating in feedback sessions, our words carry a lot of weight. Whether or not we're aware of it, how we approach feedback can have both positive and negative effects on team culture. In order to get the most positive benefits out of this, we set some specific goals for what we should be getting out of our feedback sessions. So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's one that I feel has yielded good results over the years. So we'll start with an obvious one. We want to improve the quality of the work. This is arguably the biggest reason we have feedback sessions in the first place. If teams' work isn't better than it would be without these sessions, then it's difficult to justify the time spent on them. This is especially true in a production environment. We want to build respect and trust. Feedback sessions that are constructive, positive, and supportive reinforce that we are all working together towards the same end goal. It's not just about making any one piece of art shine above others, we're collectively making everyone's work better. Over the course of a project, the team will be met with many challenges, and a team that trusts one another will be better prepared to tackle them. We want to highlight best practices. So if you're trying out a new way of solving a problem and you're finding success, share it with the team. It might not be appropriate to share, to go take a deep dive into it during a feedback session. You can handle that offline, but it's a great time to call it out because we're already looking at the end result. We want to improve individual skills. So not only will you learn from having your work evaluated by your peers, but participating in feedback session will also provide an opportunity to learn from the experience of everyone else on the team. The more you're looking at work, the more you'll train your eye to find mistakes and how to fix them. Take advantage of this time to learn from how other team members approach similar tasks as well. Pay close attention to their workflows and consider how you might apply them to your own art. Finally, we want to increase the team's confidence. Working in a creative field, we have to put a lot of ourselves into our work. It can sometimes be difficult to separate the work from the individual. For this reason, we should take the time to recognize and celebrate successes. In doing so, we aren't just acknowledging the completion of a task, but an individual's achievement as well. So what does this look like in practice? We'll roll back the clock a bit and talk about how animation feedback was handled on Civ 6. A little bit of history to set the stage. Civ 6 was my first project as a lead animator. Prior to that, I had only worked with the XCOM team, and though I knew most of the members of the Civ team, I'd only worked with them for a few months before Civ 6 really got started. This was my opportunity to put my own fingerprints on how an animation team would operate at the studio. And as good as things had been up to that point, I really wanted to find ways to do even better. So I took all the lessons I learned from working with an amazing group of artists on XCOM. I'd taken online classes after hours, attended conferences to try to just get ready for all this. And I did my best to finally put my money where my mouth was. There was also a fair amount of pressure, the good kind, to raise the bar across the board. Civilization is Firaxis Games' flagship title. It's a storied franchise that goes back to the earliest days of PC gaming. And Civ 5 was an incredibly tough act to follow. We wanted to continue that trend and aim even higher. And we needed to punch above our weight. By AAA standards, we were not a big team. In total, a dozen animators worked on the game, but there were only 5 animators on the core team for most of the duration of it. We acknowledged the need to level up our acting and animation skills on top of being increasingly more efficient. I felt that in order to do that, we would also need to step up our critiquing skills as well. So the mechanisms for giving and receiving feedback changed over the course of the project. Pre-production, for a good chunk of it, I was the only animator on the team. As team members joined the project, we would simply just call each other to our desks if we needed a fresh pair of eyes. So it's pretty informal and much more casual than it would be as we really got into production. It wasn't until then that we had enough volume animation to get through that we started holding daily feedback sessions. We also held a weekly animation meeting with the art director, designers, and other stakeholders in attendance. As we got close to the end of the project, we tried to cut down on the number of meetings though. This included art and animation reviews, including our dailies, to leave as much time as possible for work to get done. We still needed to be delivering feedback, but we tried to do it in a more efficient way. For that reason, dailies became optional for everyone except me, so I would still hold them, but if nobody needed it, we would just move on. Also, I would just meet with animators whenever it was most convenient to them. I would just be running to their desk to chat with them. There were days towards the end when I was literally running around the building, but it meant everyone else was able to focus on animating. So let's take a closer look at what our animation dailies look like. This was the format that persisted for most of the project and helped set the tone for how feedback was delivered in other settings as well. This format was based on a template that I learned from a workshop I attended years prior at SIGGRAPH 2012. To start, the animator presenting gives a 1-minute overview of the brief for their work and a 1-minute update as to the condition of the work being assessed and what work is not being assessed. This is critical to providing the right context for the review. Easily one of the things we usually skip. We just show our work and we go, what do you think? We have to do better with that. Then we would move on to the review. This was a group discussion on the work being reviewed, and we capped it at 10 minutes. As the lead, I would try and steer the conversation back towards the task at hand if we started to stray too far from the brief. Finally, the wrap. As the lead, I reviewed feedback received, followed by 2 things. I would explain what feedback we would not be acting on and why. Then I would sum up the notes that would be acted on. Then the animator whose work we were reviewing would describe as necessary how they plan to approach the revisions. Then we'd move on to the next person. This was also something that was easily skipped before, but it's super critical to make sure that everyone knew what was expected of them by the time they showed their work the next time. Animators were required to show every day, even though we did hold these every day, but we aimed to have them show at least once a week. So how did it go? Well, we'll recap the goals on the project, right? Our expectations were much higher, and we needed to level up our animation skills to deliver. We were a small team and needed our feedback sessions to be as efficient as possible. We wanted feedback focused on helping the animator achieve their stated goals. And I also hope that these sessions would inspire the team to learn from each other's successes. Did we meet these goals? We sure did. Dailies were a collaborative safe space. Not only did the quality of our work improve, but we grew collectively and individually as animators. We had set ambitious goals for the entire project, and I firmly believe that this approach played a large role in our success. Even more important to me personally, team morale and trust were sky high by the time we shipped the game. And one small thing about that structure that I described, it comes up internally when I first proposed it. It feels really scripted, and at first it did feel forced. But over time, we trying to stick to the script helped us all form better habits, and eventually we stopped keeping track of time so tightly. The review and wrap portions became less formal. We still did them, but it wasn't so like I'm doing this and this is the state that it's in. But we learned a great deal from starting out that way. I've done this a few times now on other projects, and it always ends up looking a little different a few months into practicing it. But that mostly speaks to the uniqueness of each team and project. So we've talked about setting goals. We've settled into creating the right setting for feedback in order to achieve those goals. Let's get into some advice for how to get the most out of each feedback session. One of the really important things about this whole process is to establish channels for feedback and to actually enforce them. In my experience, it makes a big difference for feedback to be delivered in a predictable way. Otherwise, feedback can come from anyone at any time, and that can be a stressful way to work. You're always looking over your shoulder, expecting no's to show up at the worst time. We're not trying to close off avenues to give feedback so much as we're trying to funnel them so that feedback is flowing in a predictable and constructive way. How you choose to do this doesn't matter nearly as actually choosing to do it. In addition to the Dailies example we just talked about, here are a few more ways to do this. I mentioned the weekly review meeting. It kind of looked like this. For that, work would be collected ahead of time and presented in a conference room setting. Meeting in a conference room could be great since you're getting to see your work on a much larger screen. It might be easier to spot things that could be missed while working on a monitor. You can also accommodate larger groups, which can sometimes be beneficial. For Civ 6, that allowed us to invite designers and other members of the art team when it was necessary. But scheduling a review meeting can sometimes be overkill. As I mentioned before, there were times when there were just 2 or 3 of us on the project, and we really didn't need to be booking rooms to be reviewing each other's work on a daily basis. Rounds. This is, instead of gathering in a meeting room, we go from desk to desk presenting our work. Historically, this has been the format most commonly used by the animation teams at Firaxis. We typically have at least one large TV now in our offices that we can gather around to make this easier. One huge benefit is that we don't need to book a meeting room to meet. It's also really convenient to not have to worry about posting play blasts or video captures. We're already at our desks. We can even review our work right in Maya and take advantage of being able to move the camera around or getting in closer. Sometimes people would even try to make a tiny adjustment and then have the team evaluate it right on the spot. Your violence may vary here, though, depending on the layout of your office. This would not be a convenient way to meet if you had an open office layout. It just annoyed everyone. If there are several artists gathering too, it could be a little hard to see the work on someone's screen. At that point, you're better off heading to that conference room. That's when we eventually got requested to have a TV in each of the animation offices. That was our workaround for that as well. Then there's Slack, or really any kind of chat-based team communication tool. Work is posted to a relevant channel for feedback. It's sort of been a necessity as we've shifted to working from home to take some of our feedback sessions onto something like Slack. It's easy and convenient to receive critiques on demand. You can post whenever you need to, and folks can respond whenever it's most convenient to them. It's also great that it can be accessed to anywhere, anytime. It can be tougher to parse through those written notes, though, and you can't really replicate the back and forth discussion that we were used to when we're all in the same room and able to speak face to face. I've been on projects where we mostly stuck to one of these, and on some where we've used all of them, or even come up with other ways to deliver the feedback. I want to stress, though, the important thing is to have some type of structure so that folks know when to expect feedback and when they'll get an opportunity to show again and continue to iterate on their work. So what are some tips for when you're at one of these sessions and you're the one receiving feedback? A really important one is to be prepared. I'll reiterate, clearly state the goal of the task. I can't stress enough how important this will be. If you say nothing else when asking for feedback, make sure you can clearly state your end goal. For example, you might be tasked with something that must be delivered quickly, so it's probably really important to mention that time is of the essence. Or maybe you've addressed around the notes and want to have your fixes evaluated. Without knowing what you were trying to fix, somebody might just repeat the same note that you got before, and then you're having a discussion about like, oh, I already got that note, and now you know it didn't work. So just kind of take the time to set the stage. If there's something specific on your animation that you want the feedback to be focused on that day, mention it. Maybe you're not ready for a full round of feedback, or you're not done with a full pass of blocking because you're stuck on a particularly tricky motion. mention those special cases so that you can get a more focused critique on that, and you can leave the rest for later. The last thing is to check yourself and make sure you're actually ready for feedback. If you're just showing something for the sake of showing it, and you still have a lot of work to do before it's really ready for a full round of feedback, consider not showing at all. It's totally fine. The reason I say this is because incomplete work is notoriously tougher to evaluate. We often spend more time trying to figure out like what could be evaluated and what isn't. So as a rule of thumb, I try not to show until I've exhausted my own to-do lists to avoid getting those to-do items back as notes. And I'll typically aim to show my blocking, my first pass, and then a final pass. Which brings us to talking about what state of the process you're in. Depending on your workflow, the state of your work might not be immediately clear. Some animators spline right out of the gate, and a blocking pass might not be discernible from a poorly polished animation. That makes a huge difference. So make sure you communicate where you are in the process. If someone is still in the blocking stages, the review should focus on the clarity of the ideas, not on trying to catch pops or feet sliding. Trust that they'll deliver a polished animation by the time they're done. Likewise, if they're already polishing, refrain from making suggestions that would require significant rework. Not only is it counterproductive, it can be really demoralizing. Leads especially, keep an eye out for this and don't hesitate to step in to keep the conversations on track. The other thing is, are you seeking approval to move on to the next phase? Make sure to mention that. Sometimes you don't actually need a full round of notes. You're just showing to get that next approval. So I've treated these in the past as simple pass or fails. If you pass, there's like little to no discussion. You get the thumbs up and see you next day. At least we don't need to have a big discussion over it. But if it's not ready to move on, we can discuss what needs to be addressed before moving forward. Is there anything else that is there anything that we shouldn't focus on? This is also important. Maybe the character has a ponytail or some other element that might need secondary motion, and you're not going to animate it until you're into the polish phase. Call that out in case it's distracting, and so we don't spend time discussing it. Lastly, practice active listening. That's to make a conscious effort to not just hear the words, but to understand the complete message of what your teammates are saying. Don't interrupt, and do not start formulating counter arguments in your head while others are speaking. It's just disrespectful, but it kind of can derail the entire feedback session. But at the same token, try not to be defensive in the discussion. Soak in all that feedback, and then make sure that when you leave your feedback session, you have a clear direction about what you will and will not be expected to address. Let's go over some tips for giving feedback. Some people think of critique as listing out positive or negative things. Here's some good things, here's some bad things. But usually those type of assessments are based on subjective measures like taste and personal preference. Instead, ensure your feedback is constructive and focused on the task as described by the artist presenting it. The best notes will help the artist achieve their stated goal. This is why it's so important that the person showing their work express that from the beginning. That provides the context for the feedback session to go well. Opinions are okay to express, but they should be properly framed. Is that note going to help them achieve their goal, or is it just going to steer their work towards your own personal preferences and what you might have done? If the work being reviewed satisfies the task at hand, consider whether it is worth sharing that opinion in this setting. You could talk to people later. This isn't to say that we shouldn't have these type of conversations, but when you're actually in the feedback session, I prefer to leave that stuff for later. Next up is plussing. So you've likely heard this term before. Plussing is the idea that you can always plus something, meaning make it even better than it already is. Always remember that better must be within the context of that stated goal. Different doesn't mean better. Improv provides a great philosophy to build upon to help us with plussing. We are going to start with your idea, and we're going to help you turn it into a stronger idea without forcing you to abandon it. I even try to borrow some of that language from improv, which is the yes and. So you're in agreement with what's in front of you, and here's some ways to make it better. It's also good that when you take your approach it this way, even after all the notes and revisions, you should still be able to trace the end result back to the original idea. This reinforces the idea of ownership and makes artists feel empowered that what they're bringing to the table isn't being ignored once it gets put through the process. Feedback that you give should be actionable. This means, can the person receiving the note actually act on it? Would they have time to address it? Does it run counter to earlier direction that they were given? Is it something you know from experience that the rig can't even do? Depending on the setting, I caution against engaging in discussion about anything that simply can't be done. By all means, feel free to discuss these things offline. Maybe they could even lead to important conversations about things that could be improved. But if it doesn't help the artist accomplish their immediate task, like in that moment, it ends up killing the conversation. Sometimes it can be kind of deflating to have all these cool ideas brought up, and you have to sit there and be like, oh, I can't really do that, or I don't have time. It just kind of brings the brings the room down. So again, it's another thing to leave for offline. And I have some advice for leads. These are some of the tougher lessons I've learned over the years. The first one is that nothing's ever really done. It is your responsibility to define what done will be on your project, and up to you to enforce it. Work can always be improved upon, but there are diminishing returns, and getting caught in a feedback loop that goes on for too long can hurt morale. You might also need to make a call about when to stop working on something, even if the artist really, really wants to keep working on it. You're responsible for the big picture, and your team will thank you later for helping them stay on schedule. Avoid changing direction note by note. If direction needs to change significantly, it's best to handle that in a one-on-one discussion outside of the feedback session. The image I always have in my head for this is that scene in Cinderella when the stepsisters are tearing her gown apart piece by piece before the ball. If that much about an animation needs to change, there's something not clear about the task or the direction given. So try your best not to let this happen. Embrace the unique qualities each person brings to the team. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. Be mindful of this when assigning tasks, and make sure you're doing your best to set each artist up for success. Finally, hold yourself accountable to your decisions. Likewise, hold the team accountable for their actions and what they're promising as well. If someone's work is scrutinized later, own up to the direction you gave, and don't let that criticism fall solely on their shoulders. Let them know you have their back and that they can work confidently under your direction. So just to wrap up, we want to approach feedback with multiple goals in mind. This can ensure that we're getting more benefits from these feedback sessions than just improving the quality of our work. We want to evaluate that progress made towards those goals over the course of a project and adjust our practices accordingly. And again, I'll reiterate, we hold each other accountable in pursuits of those goals. So leads, hold your artists accountable, and artists, hold your leads accountable as well. Remember that we're all working together. So I hope that you'll embrace feedback as a tool for not just improving your team's work, but for building a culture of support, trust, and growth. I want to quickly give a shout out to 3 fellow animators who helped me gather my thoughts in putting this talk together. So thanks, Brian, Justin, and Dennis for listening to me over the past few weeks and months. And thank you all for coming today. I think we have like a minute for questions, maybe. If you'd like to chat, you can find me on Twitter. I would love to continue this conversation.
All right. Hello, Hector. I'm here. I'm here with some questions. Hang on one second. Let me make sure. All right. We have some great ones. Thank you for that. Talk so much. All right. One from Melissa is, how would you look for opportunities for team members to take on new responsibilities toward their career goals if their day-to-day tasks don't necessarily lend them directly towards those things?
I would specifically encourage artists to if I were that person's lead, I would just preach come talk to me about it. There's actually have plenty of examples about that. We have one animator on Civ 6 who was kind of split between he really liked doing a lot of the tech animation work and a lot of animation work. And traditionally the leader work was some of the those are kind of like our hero scenes on Civilization. And we had a conversation at one point, and I said, do you want to do the rigging stuff because we have plenty of that to do, or do you want to do animation? And eventually he was like, I want to do animation. So great. So we talked about it, and we just shifted the work over to where it was just full animation all the time after that point. So it's just one of those things where like talk to your don't hesitate to bring that up to your lead because they might not know. Like in the case in this example I just mentioned, I would have been more than happy to just continue to do 50-50 split between rigging work and animation
Right,
if you
yeah.
hadn't spoken up. So it is just that thing of like, continue to talk. One thing I didn't mention in the talk, um, but in addition to all these feedback sessions, we did do some one-on-ones. I would use those to sort of kick off work at the beginning of sprints with different artists. And just knowing that like we would meet at least once a sprint in that setting, I think kind of made it feel a little bit easier to have those conversations. Because it would typically be like, hey, here's what we're going to be working on this sprint. Here's how I think the last sprint went. Is there anything on your mind? And so
Right,
you
yeah.
kind of set this, you're kind of giving them an opening as well. So yeah, if you're a lead, make sure that you're creating a safe space to have that conversation. And if you're an artist, like, man, talk to your lead right away.
Yeah.
It might be as simple as asking.
Yeah. So that was, I think that probably leads us right into our next question, which is, how involved do you think a lead or a director should be in their team members' growth versus a manager who might not be familiar with their day-to-day responsibilities? Do you think that's more of the lead's job, or do you think that's more of like a manager's job?
Tricky because I bet it's totally different per studio.
Hmm.
And even within the studio, I feel like sometimes those things are um, it could even depend on the project. At our studio, we usually have there's a studio art director who's more in charge of our career development and stuff, and the projects have different art directors. So in that sense, the studio art director is the person we would have those conversations with the most because you're not guaranteed to be traveling from project to project with the same art director. So
Gotcha.
so those sort of the sort of meta goals
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
end up being better tracked by. But we have that structure at Firaxis. But if your studio doesn't have that structure, then I would think it sort of falls towards the art director. Although having spent some time art directing now, there's so much of my time dedicated just to the project.
Hmm.
One of the adjustments I had to make was realizing I couldn't spend as much one-on-one time with individual artists. Um, so like absent the studio art director role, even your art director might not be the best person for that. Maybe it is your immediate lead.
Yeah,
So
gotcha.
yeah, it's kind of tricky. I'd say, yeah, to wrap up that answer, in the structure that I'm in, it makes sense because we're a studio with multiple projects
Mhm.
and we have this studio art director. Um, but if you're on a one studio team, have those conversations with your leads and with your art director.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was really helpful. I think we're out of time, but can you shout
Awesome.
out like where people can find you if they wanna ask you more questions or hear more from
Yeah.
you?
Twitter's the best way. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn and you can find me, but I rarely check that.
Same.
But
Hard same.
yeah, like most of us, that have been talking, we really are just kind of loitering around on Twitter. So
Yeah.
that's the best way. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
All right. Thank you so much, Hector.
Awesome.